My role in all this is to facilitate. What people have asked me to do is, aside from facilitating, to make an introductory comment about it all, to introduce the speakers, and then basically to help you ask questions and make comments. I wanted to just make a quick comment about what we just heard. I really liked Stephen's presentation, not merely because he has a nice first name, but about asking the tough questions, the problematic ones, the ones that are not easy to answer and don't have clear and easy answers, and things that people should actually struggle with. I also noted his allusion to not merely talking about responsibility and so forth, but he pointed to the Australasian Compliance Institute. I might mention that that organization, in doing things about compliance, actually has a very firm commitment to ethics and social responsibility as part of its accreditation process for all the levels. I mention that not merely because I wrote those bits. The comments that I want to make are just these, which are in some ways meant to incite a riot. When moral philosophers talk about defining the word ethical, one of the hallmarks of this is regarding your own interest, that is self-interest, as less than foremost. That is, looking beyond self-interest. So when people talk about ethical, they're talking about reasons for taking somebody else's interest into account, even though that might cost you something in terms of your own interest. You should keep your promise even when it's inconvenient for you to do so. You should tell the truth, even though it will be uncomfortable. You should give money to charity, even though you could otherwise treat yourself to something that you would like. Those are all kinds of ethical comments or prescriptions. When the talk is about the prudential, that is, matters of prudence, the talk is about serving your own interests. You should see the dentist regularly. You should eat a low cholesterol diet. You should avoid speeding when going through the Eastern Distributor. Those are all matters of prudence. On the one hand, then, there's the ethical, and on the other hand is the prudential. There's a danger in talking about ethics to business. The danger is that there are values and so forth, but nothing really gets done. A further danger is that when you're talking about ethics and the listener is receptive, then they're already convinced, for whatever reason, and so you're really preaching only to the converted. That's a serious problem. This is an inherent difficulty in speaking at an important event like this one. That is, we are the converted. We should take seriously the question, what's the point in our speaking to and with each other about CSR? We're not, after all, at an evangelical prayer meeting, we're not at a pep rally, and we're not at an Amway sales meeting. Be ethical. This has become something of a mantra, but identifying its substance and then convincing anybody who's not already converted is a very big ask. One strategy for those who would hope to incorporate corporate social responsibility among the business community is to link the ethical with the prudential. This is the ethical thing to do, and it will serve your self-interest. Hence the phrase, good ethics is good business. Personally, I think that's not always true, if good business does in fact mean that which enhances the bottom line. So sustainability has become the link. That's become the link between the ethical and the prudential. Engage in ethical CSR practices, and that will benefit the business in the long term. That is, CSR is a means to the sustainability of business. One problem here is that the notion of sustainability has itself, to a great extent, become as much of a mantra as be ethical. A fair bit of the talk about CSR practices being connected to business sustainability seems to me to be such that it wouldn't convince those of us who are not already convinced of this. If the right strategy for promoting corporate social responsibility is to link it to self-interest in one way or another, then some serious thought has to be given not merely to the fact that these two are indeed linked, but also to what could convince somebody of this. That is, somebody who might be very skeptical of that connection. I've talked about preaching to the converted and convincing the converted. These are interesting and they're important, but they don't get very much done. There's two things then. One is, how do you get the ear and the attention of the skeptical? And the second is, what does it take then to convince those enterprises, or if not to convince them, then to force them to take corporate social responsibility seriously? Those are my introductory comments. As I said, my role is not to give a talk, so what I just gave you is not a talk. But rather my role is to introduce the other speakers. On the program, Stephen Bartos' name came first, but he told me before we began this session that he would rather not go first and would probably like to go last because he wanted to save you from increased boredom that he thought he might generate in giving the talk that he gave. So what I'd first like to do, I'll just mention all the speakers to you, then I won't have to come back over here and say them again. You've already met Stephen Bartos, and you know who he is. Attracta Lagan will talk first. She's the principal of Managing Values and has done lots of work in this area for quite a number of years now, both consulting to various organizations and writing quite a bit in this general area. She's going to speak about public virtue and private vice, the downside of a poor CSR strategy. And she's mentioned to me that she's going to speak anecdotally. She's going to offer quick case studies. After she speaks, Andrew Beatty will speak, who's a partner at Baker & McKenzie. He'll talk about CSR and sustainability reporting, why your lawyer is wrong to be nervous. And then it will be up to you. This entire session is a little less than an hour. Each of the presentations, including my own introductory comments and facilitation, is to be very short, and so that's what we'll now do. It's over to Attracta Lagan.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm going to be very quick. Well, as you've heard from the two previous speakers, ethics are the defining questions of the 21st century, and I don't think anyone's asked them yet. I think the question that everyone seems to avoid is who's responsible for the public good, both nationally and on a global scale. And CSR certainly hasn't stepped up to that agenda yet. We're still bogged down in building the business case. So CSR is basically a reaction to a value shift by civil society, and civil society is still way out in front in its values than the business community is. However, I think the tide is turning, that there is a mood sweeping through Australian business and government, a mood to clean up our act. We're much more intolerant of ethical lapses, be they in the private or the public sector. People do want to move to the higher ground. I'm talking here about civil society citizens as opposed to the other sectors. People want to move to the higher ground, and they're asking more of how people behave and to whom they're accountable. Many of us are aware, of course, that there is no such thing as a level playing field. We're also aware that that old idea that we used to have in Australia about people giving people a fair go is more myth than actual reality. Instead of lauding those sort of virtues, today what we do is we laud people with lots of power and money, however they got it. So we also are probably part of the problem, but I'm sure you've heard that this morning. So CSR for me has a major risk issue still embedded in it, in that it lags behind civil society's changing values. And I have to say Australia as a nation also probably lags behind this civil society in the European context and the American and Canadian contexts who are leading the charge on this. CSR is a global movement. It hasn't been invented in Australia, and Australia is a laggard in terms of the CSR debate, unfortunately. However, hopefully we can all change that in this room. The limitations of CSR, as I see it today, is that it continues to have an external focus. All we're doing is harvesting the low-hanging fruit. We're not actually looking inside our organisations and seeing how we impact upon each other. We still manage organisations out of a Taylorist model that was developed in 1920. So still we are not giving people the respect they deserve in the workplace. The CSR function reports into typically public affairs, so it's part of the lobbying strategy of an organisation. It's not part of the core strategy. It's not reporting into the CEO. There are one or two exceptions. Westpac has a board accountability for CSR, but they're the exceptions. That's not the rule. So it's still part of the lobbying strategy of business. The other reason why CSR is lagging is because we all operate in free markets. We operate in a labour market, and of course that's where CSR has got its most traction as we try to become the employer of choice. We operate in capital markets, and although we have the ethical investment movement, believe me, it's a tiny, tiny part of the capital markets, so it doesn't really have traction there. And of course we operate in consumer markets, and this is where we all get to share the blame. It hasn't got any traction there. As the CEO of Levi Strauss said, now, Levi Strauss is one of the leaders in CSR. They pulled out of Burma because of child labour. They pulled out of China for the same reasons. And when they were interviewing the CEO about, well, this must have given you a competitive advantage, he said, no way, because people buy denims based on, what do you think, for example, women buy denims based on? Sorry? No, do I look thin in this? And that is the problem. We are part of the problem. We're not putting our money where our values are. We're still buying and supporting products that make us look good rather than do some good in the world. So it's another inconvenient truth, unfortunately. We're part of the problem. I think CSR is also limited in that it is not a voice in public policy, and it's not trying to be a voice in public policy. And it was really interesting that Walmart has finally turned around and said to the US government they should lift the minimum wage in America, because it's not creating social capital. So for the first time you see a company now who is engaging in public policy, and I think if we're ever going to address that question, who's responsible for the public good, companies have to step up to that. But that's probably a step too far at the moment. CSR, of course, is really about global supply chains now. It's a global issue. And this is the great bit about business and how business can raise the ethical standards below the global marketplace. When activists went to Mattel 2 years ago at Christmas, threatening to expose that their toys for children were made by children in Mexico, they very quickly changed their practices. Similarly with De Beers and Blood Diamonds, when Oxfam went to De Beers and said, unless you start to work with us in trying to eradicate the diamond payments for arms, we will start to run a campaign that diamonds are not a girl's best friend, that they're actually causing a lot of child soldiers to be killed in Africa. Then De Beers very quickly changed. And of course we saw with Nike and the whole high brand retail clothing industry, when they were under attack, they quickly lifted the standards throughout their supply chain. So the great thing about globalization and global brands is that it has given civil society an opportunity to hold companies to account in one country for their standards in another country. And, as I say, to raise our ethical floor below the global marketplace. We just need consumers to come in a bit more behind that and support those companies that are doing that. I think for those who have not signed up to doing CSR, there's enormous risks inherent in doing that. If you don't want to sign up to do it because it's the right thing to do, then sign up to do it because you might lose your reputation. I think there's a great risk for Australia in that we're lagging the rest of the world. The UK, for example, has a minister for CSR. Most of the Europeans see this as mainstream. They have various legislation in place to report on the triple bottom line. So Australia has got a potential of losing its best people. We will have a flight of talent, just like we saw in Northern Ireland when we had a government that was behind the times. We lost our most, the brightest of my generation had to flee the country. That may well happen to Australia unless it starts to join in with the rest of the world in addressing these bigger issues. And of course our own social evolution. We have to see that we are part of the solution to that. So I'm just going to leave you with David Cortins, who wrote what did he write? Does anyone know? Does anyone know David Cortins? I forgot the name of the book now. It's something like When Corporations Rule the World. Alzheimer's. So when he wrote the book, When Corporations Rule the World, he asked this question, will we continue to leave our future to the chance roll of the dice of global currency speculators? Or will we tune into a higher purpose and set a different course? I hope the rise of civil society and the civil economy will give us that opportunity to do that. Thank you. Make it personal.
Hello everybody, I'm just waiting for the technology to kick in here.
Okay.
I'm one of those generation of lawyers that still uses a dictaphone rather than typing all my own stuff, so... Thank you. Ian, terrific. It's a pretty odd sort of heading for a speech, I suppose, and you're probably wondering why there's a lawyer here anyway. And I had the reaction at my table during the last discussion that I had in Amsterdam last month when I was at the Global Reporting Initiative conference. CERES, a few of you will know, is a coalition for environmentally responsible economies, came into being after the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1997. CERES ultimately gave birth to the Global Reporting Initiative, and that was why I was in Amsterdam last month, attending the conference for the launch of G3, which many of you will be familiar with, which is the latest reporting template for companies around the world. I went to a side event run by CERES. There were a number of major institutional and ethical investment funds represented, and they launched a template letter and template shareholder resolution for activists to use to ask CEOs whose companies didn't produce sustainability reports why not. Now, when you get a letter signed by people that represent $300 billion worth of assets under management, you probably should be paying attention. I said, well, I didn't disclose who I was. I said, what's the main reason why companies refuse to do this? You know, what reasons do they give? And the answer uniformly was, well, we usually strike out when the only person we can get to in the company is the in-house counsel. The lawyers are the ones that are stopping a lot of this from happening because they're worried about risk. They're worried about companies reporting on things which might end up in lawsuits, a la Nike and Kasky. So, as I say, the reaction I had at my table when I said I was a lawyer was everybody sort of makes a little noise out of their mouth and pushes their chair back a little bit. So, I know there aren't probably too many other lawyers in the room here, or maybe there will be this afternoon. I want to give you 4 reasons why your lawyer, or maybe your unreconstructed fellow director, probably doesn't want you involved in CSR. First of all, she understands directors' duties pretty well, because you have to study it at law school, and lots of judges talk about it, but she doesn't understand CSR, doesn't understand the distinction, I suppose, between being a shareholder and a stakeholder. Sometimes they're the same thing, but oftentimes they're not. And that distinction is made sharper by the fact that CSR itself, ironically, is a little bit of an ambiguous alphabet soup of competing policies, initiatives, guidelines and what have you. The second reason is, and this is the classic lawyer's reason, is that if you admit a failure in a public document, you're admitting guilt and somebody's going to use that against you. And true it is, if it's not written properly, that might happen. The third reason is that if you make promises that you don't keep, you might be found to be guilty of misrepresentation under the Trade Practices Act or equivalent legislation around the world. And that's exactly what Mr. Kasky did when he sued Nike in the United States. Nike had said, we do various things in the factories which make our products. And Mr. Kasky said, no, in fact, no, you don't. You don't do that. You do something different. And Nike's public relations manager, now called a sustainability manager, was at the conference in Amsterdam last month, and she talked about Nike's very public journey. Nike now has 30 people working full-time on sustainability issues. And the last thing that your lawyer will say is, well, look, if it's not required by law, why should you do it? We've only had very tentative examples of CSR-type laws in this country. There's 299(1)F of the Corporations Law, which says certain companies in their annual reports have to say whether or not they are affected by particular and significant environmental laws. And you can answer that in an annual report in a one-liner. Yes, no, or we comply. There are, of course, ongoing inquiries into CSR in this country. We've had the Joint Parliamentary Committee report. It's been out for a while now, and interestingly it says the government should spend money educating SMEs and larger corporations on the use of the GRI. We've got the Corporations and Markets Advisory Committee, which will probably report in the next week or so on CSR. And the ASX, of course, is in the middle of a review of its corporate governance guidelines at the moment. And it's grappling with whether or not to require, through a shaming system, listed entities, including listed trusts in Australia, to produce codes of conduct about their CSR practices. Let's wait and see. My view on the last point is, if it's not required by law, why do it? Well, yeah, but the other thing the lawyer will say is, why do you need to stick your neck out? Why do you need to be like a Walmart? We heard what Margot said about Walmart this morning. There's apparently an email floating around from somebody within Walmart saying, well, if somebody gets sick, let's get rid of them. I want to talk about Walmart from the other side at the end of this discussion. All right, now I've got to work out how to go back. Sorry, I've stuffed it up, haven't I? Just to give you an idea of how quickly things have changed in the law. When I started practice as a lawyer, and I'm now been in practice over 20 years, mainly doing environmental work, environmental law wasn't actually offered as a subject at Sydney University. Now I engage with people, junior lawyers, who've got master's degrees. So you can't blame me for mucking up the slideshow. Okay, here's 4 reasons why your lawyer or fellow director should help you embrace CSR. It's not rocket science, CSR, but it's not mere corporate philanthropy either. Each company has to understand it by defining how it works with them. And if you compare what, for example, Westpac does with what either the ANZ does or, importantly, the AMP do, Westpac has, I don't use this pejoratively, has more of a scattergun approach, whereas the AMP is particularly focused, particularly targeted on doing CSR things which relate to its particular business. And it's interesting, we've gone nearly 3 or 4 hours in this conference and nobody's yet had a stab at a definition of CSR. Because I'm a lawyer, I'll do it, and I'll tell you how I define it. I define it as a voluntary action designed to address a company's impacts on people and the environment for the benefit of its shareholders and those affected by its operations. Voluntary action designed to address a company's impacts on people and the environment for the benefits of its shareholders and those affected by its operations. Next point I'd make is it's far better to understand what your critics are saying and to answer your critics in reports rather than in court. And obviously, if you're producing reports, here's the shameless advertisement. Lawyers are trained to write things which don't get you into trouble. I'll give you a quick example of this. A few years ago, I was doing some work for a major Australian mining company in the Pilbara. It had an acid mine drainage problem at one of its mines. And this was a problem which we feared was so large that the most terrifying thing that we could think of was the thud of the 60 Minutes helicopter coming over the horizon with its cameras trained on this dam. What did we do? Well, instead of hiding it or what have you, we actually went public and we actually told the local community, this is the problem, this is what we're trying to do to fix it, these are the risks. Didn't rate a story. Third point is CSR doesn't mean promising the world. I think it probably means gradualism. I think it means making promises that you can ultimately keep. Lastly, there are, and it's hard for a lawyer to admit this, but there are forces at work greater than the law in the world. Corporations began their existence, East India Company, Hudson's Bay, what have you, as vehicles designed to keep things, to keep information private and to limit the liability of shareholders. Over the last, 70 years, I guess starting with the development of the modern law of negligence, we've seen that corporate veil taken off in various stages, the dance of the 7 corporate veils. Mature companies are now competing to see who can be the most naked. Supply chain politics, I'll come to that. We've also got the early mover advantage. If you're the first to go carbon neutral, if you're the first to have certain workplace agreements that are beneficial, not pernicious, then you are going to take an early mover advantage. You will get a seat at the table when governments come to inevitably regulate this area. The other benefits, of course, are self-evident, and it is preaching the converter, but you've got risk management, you've got staff attraction and retention, and you've got investor relations. Let's just talk about Walmart briefly. Walmart came in for heavy criticism, and is still coming in for heavy criticism, because one, it's very big, and two, recently it stuck its neck out. I recently read the speech given by its CEO in October last year, which launched, or rather relaunched, Walmart's offensive in relation to environmental and social issues. I'm going to give you some quick quotes from that speech by Lee Scott. I think this is one of the most revolutionary things I've ever read. Here's what he said. To better understand our critics and Walmart's impact on the world and society, we spent a year meeting with and listening to customers. Listening to customers, government leaders, non-profit and non-government associations. Walmart, if we were a country, we would be the 20th largest in the world. If Walmart were a city, we would be the 5th biggest in America. People expect a lot of us, and they have a right to. Due to our size and scope, we are uniquely positioned to have great success and impact in the world, perhaps like no company before us. Nothing brought this home to me more clearly than Hurricane Katrina. Katrina was a key personal moment for me. He goes on in some detail about what they did to help people out who were affected by Katrina. During this time, we were asked by governments, relief agencies and communities to help. And look what happened. We were showered with gratitude, kindness and acknowledgements. This was Walmart at its best. Then he asks this question. What if the very things that many people criticise us for, our size and reach, became a trusted friend and ally to all, just as it did in Katrina? In the group meetings I referred to before, we talked about jobs, healthcare, community involvement, product sourcing, diversity, environmental impact, all the issues we've been dealing with historically from a defensive posture. What became clear is that in order to build a 21st century company, we need to view these same things in a different light. We should view the environment as Katrina in slow motion. As one of the largest companies in the world with an expanding global presence, environmental problems are our problems. The supply of natural products, fish, food, water, can only be sustained if the ecosystems that provide them are sustained and protected. There are not two worlds out there, a Walmart world and some other world. Our environmental goals at Walmart are simple and straightforward. 1, to be supplied 100% by renewable energy. 2, to create zero waste. 3, to sell products that sustain our resources and environment. Now, from Margot's perspective, that is a fairly big, hairy set of priorities, I would have thought, for a company this size. He then goes on and talks about energy. We have one of the largest private fleets in the US. At today's prices, if we improve our fleet fuel mileage by just 1 mile per gallon, we can save over $52 million a year. Compare that to doing nothing. We want to eliminate 30% of the energy used by our stores. Then he goes on and talks about climate change, which I won't bore you with here. What we intend to do is share all the learnings in technology with the world, including our competitors. We want to assist in the design and support of a green company program in China where Walmart would show preference to those suppliers and their factories involved in such a program. We want to initiate a program here in the US over the next 18 months that would show preference to suppliers who set their own goals and aggressively reduce their own emissions. Pausing there quickly, Sarah Lee had never done a sustainability report until Walmart, one of their biggest customers, said, we're doing one, we'd like you to do one too. Now that's not compliance. You don't need to do sustainability reports. That's just the power of the supply chain. These commitments are a first step, he went on to say. To address climate change, we need to cut emissions worldwide. We know that these commitments won't even maintain our fast-growing company's overall emissions at current levels. The waste paradigm is the one that I really find extraordinary. Reduction of waste is our second goal and represents one of our most visible opportunities. Think about it. If we throw it away, we had to buy it first. So we pay twice, once to get it, once to have it taken away. What if we reverse that cycle? What if our suppliers send us less and everything they send us has a value as a recycled product? No waste, and we get paid instead. what he's going to do is he then goes on and says, this means working with our 60,000 plus suppliers and educating them, hence the Sarah Lee thing. I'll give you one last thing here. Our packaging team, for example, worked with our packaging supplier to reduce excessive packaging on some of our private label Kid Connection toy products. By making the packaging just a little bit smaller on one private brand of toys, we will use 497 fewer containers and generate freight savings of over $2.4 million per year. Additionally, we'll save more than 3,800 trees and more than 1,000 barrels of oil. Again, think about this with Walmart's scale in mind. This represents one relatively simple package change on one private toy brand. Now, what I'd say to you after hearing all of that, and I do think this is revolutionary stuff, is just imagine what impacts we would see in Australia if Coles or Woolworths wanted to do this, or some of the other the big employers. What if our government started legislating for some of this stuff? Walmart is on par with the Australian government in terms of its global reach as an economy. Let me finish with hopefully a note like this. So if your lawyer says no to CSR, you should be saying to your lawyer, what am I meant to do instead? Instead of just keeping these people at the gate, what am I meant to do instead? 4 key messages for your company or for the people that you're trying to persuade, because I sense there are more people in the room here who've already got the message and are trying to persuade others of it. First thing is, you need to say to people who haven't embarked on the journey, you need to understand what it is for your company and what it's not. Have a look at what you're trying to achieve. Explore the benefits for your company and tailor your activities accordingly. One size does not fit all. Have a look at the GRI menu and select. Reporting is a good risk management discipline. And then I finish off by saying, can you afford to wait to be told? Who's going to tell you about it, I guess? Your customers, your investors, your bankers, your insurers. Ultimately, it will be your government, because I think there will be legislation for this within probably 4 or 5 years in Australia. And lastly, what about your competitors? Well, they're going to tell you in a fairly indirect way because they're going to steal business. Last point, I guess, this comes out of what Margot said, is can you wait for a crisis? A lot of these companies see a burning bush because they have a personal crisis, a professional crisis, or a business crisis. Can you wait for a crisis? Thanks.
Stephen says I can have a few minutes. I wanted to not go straight after my last presentation because I did feel you'd get rather bored hearing my voice again, but I wanted to talk more broadly about the dimensions of corporate social responsibility, because I mentioned our responsibilities to Indigenous people. We have responsibilities overseas. One of the things about our international responsibilities is issues to do with sourcing of supply, and is that something where a corporate social responsibility dimension is taken account of? We heard a little bit about fair trade coffee, which is a terrific initiative, but think more broadly in terms of supply, especially raw materials, such as wood. I do work in the Solomon Islands. That country is facing a really corrosive environment of corruption because of the bribery of government officials in order to get logging rights. And if we buy cheap wood from the Solomon Islands in order to give ourselves a competitive advantage, what are we doing? We're just encouraging that. So the international dimension as well is a part of corporate social responsibility. The environmental dimension, I think, goes without saying, but one of the really interesting things there is the fact that we're seeing a situation where, in terms of the wave of interest in actually addressing issues such as global warming in Australia, rather than government leading, bringing along companies with them, and then bringing along the community, it's been the reverse. So the impetus has been coming from grassroots demand that something be done, a few leading companies being well ahead of government for quite some time, and only now government getting onto the bandwagon. So I think that one of the things that struck me very strongly from what Attractor was saying was, yes, it's true that Australia is a laggard. By comparison with some of the leading corporations in the United States, we have no one who's saying the sorts of things that are being said in Walmart. But there are opportunities. I think one of the messages I'd want to just finish off with is there are opportunities for us to actually influence what happens. And because Australia is behind doesn't mean that this group in this room is powerless. That there is a huge opportunity to influence corporate social responsibility. Make a submission to the Australian Stock Exchange on its review of its corporate governance guidelines. Deadline's not till February. Plenty of time to make a submission as a corporation into that process. Influence government, and this is probably my last point because it follows on from some of the questioning that I had on my presentation. One of our problems in this country is the extent of cynicism about politics. The fact that as voters, we're quite happy with the notion that politicians lie to us and we keep re-electing them. And we seem to have this view that, well, they all lie anyway, so we might as well vote for the lot who's going to put more dollars in our pockets. The extent of cynicism is seen in the flight from political parties, the fact that their memberships have dropped dramatically in terms of the two major parties, Liberal and Labor, even though they've been growing for some of the minor parties. The fact that we do keep re-electing people who, from the top, tell us fibs. Why do we do this? What's going on here? And part of it is relating to corporate social responsibility. Ask yourselves, have you taken a minister out to a corporate tent and plied them with wine and expensive gifts in order to get a favour for your company? If you've been doing that, you've been adding to this general climate of cynicism. You've been encouraging this view that they're all the same. And it is something that strikes me as being, in terms of the message from my presentation, that ethics has to start from the top. We also have to start right from the top in this country. And unless we start holding our political leaders to account for their ethical behaviours, then it's going to be really hard to encourage corporate social responsibility as well. And that's something that we can each do, because we each, as citizens, have a vote and access to our own members of parliament, and we can hold them accountable too. So I'd probably suggest a little bit of empowerment here in terms of doing some of that yourselves as a way of encouraging that better behaviour from the top. I said I'd keep it to 2 minutes. I want to leave as much time as possible for questions and discussion.
Thanks very much to all that. As I mentioned to you before, we have all up a little less than an hour, which leaves us about 15 minutes for comments or questions. I wanted to mention just one thing. When Andrew was talking about the danger of unfulfilled promises and used Nike as an example, it's a wonderful example. I also know that Attracta has done some research into actually dollar values of what it costs to retrieve a reputation once lost or once damaged. And it occurred to me, I have a colleague who did some research about 3 years ago into the management strategies of some sports companies. He did Reebok, Adidas, Nike, and Puma. And he came up with some pretty interesting results that were showing they were all actually traveling pretty well as 3 years ago. I did, as any academic, I did the research necessary about value of reputations. Namely, I asked my daughter what she thought. My daughter is a die-hard environmentalist, and I asked her, as I say, as research, when she won't wear any Nike products, and I asked her what she could ever learn about Nike that would get her to wear Nike tennis shoes. And her answer was nothing. That is, there's nothing she could now learn, and she's by no means alone. I think she's actually quite a good example. of a reputation damaged, or at least perceived to be damaged, in a very serious way, is in some respects just not retrievable. Anyway, that's another nice comment to make. So I'm now done making my comments, and I'll turn it over to you. There is a microphone around.
Hi, I'm Swagger, and I'm actually from a mental health service, so I'm coming to this summit with a very different perspective. And I guess the question that keeps coming up for me is about the immense power that could actually happen if a number of corporations could come together and form some sort of a national voice or body that represents these views to the government, so advocates to the government, but also takes on a role of engaging the community and people, your average citizen who maybe isn't involved in engaging in these sort of activities. So my question's really about whether that sort of body exists, or what people's...
Yeah, that sounds like it's working. Short answer is yes. And the second part of the short answer is, amongst other things, MOS, Models of Success and Sustainability, which is organising this conference. I had a chat to Anne-Marie Huxley about our making a MOS submission to the ASX on the corporate governance guidelines, which, if implemented in a mature way, would have an immediate impact on the whole Australian economy, because it will influence the way in which all listed enterprises, including trusts, have to behave. So the points I'd make very quickly are, we mustn't take our democracy for granted. If you're already a card-carrying member of the CSR club, you've got an obligation to say something and do something. And there are a couple of just very quick examples I'd give of how powerful that can be. When the companies which comprise the Climate Change Roundtable got together and sort of broke away from what the Business Council was saying, and you added to that what people were saying in response to questions from the Lowy Institute, we saw what I think is one of the most remarkable changes of political direction in this country in the last 3 months. In other words, all of a sudden we recognise at a political level there's climate change, we have to do something about it. So now that probably wouldn't have happened but for those things, I suspect. So, and the bigger you are, in a collective sense, the more likely it is that your voice will be heard. So, yeah.
There are two organisations in Australia, the BCA, which is the Business Council of Australia, which does not champion this agenda. And then there's the Australian Institute of Company Directors, which does not champion this agenda either. The organisations that do it at a global level are BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, out of California, and they will give you world's best practice, so you can go there. The Co-Round Table, CAUX, out of Switzerland. And then we have a thing called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But it's it's a bit of, it's very hard to get a business peak body because they're basically competitors with each other. So you really have to look for a not-for-profit. And Business for Social Responsibility is about the biggest global. But then the people who operate in the vacuum of global governance, which is what we've got, which is why you've got CSR, have always been Oxfam and the big charities. They're the people that champion the public rights around the world. So also look at them. They do some fantastic research.
Yeah, all over the place, yeah.
We've heard that corporations are economically as powerful as governments, as in Walmart versus Australia. You're talking about a submission to the ASX, and Doctor, you talked about the 3 types of capital. What does the government need to do? There's an obvious market failure here. What does the government need to do to reward corporations in terms of their balance sheet for spending on the environment? It's a global asset. If they're going to spend on it, what are they going to get so they get an impact on their value?
Doctor of the House. I'm trying to think now. Corporations. Well, government's a laggard, let me tell you. Governments all around the world are laggards. What is changing the world today is civil regulation by citizens around the world who are marching in Seattle, marching in Washington, marching down in Melbourne, saying, for example, just earlier this week to the G8 in Melbourne, you're not representing us. We have to actually employ the police to stop these people getting near our government ministers. So what does government has to do to get corporations? They've got to start listening to what the people are saying, because not only are people, as Stephen said, fleeing out of political parties, but they're fleeing out of corporations. The biggest growth in employment in the Western world is in the not-for-profit sector, because people are looking for a sense of purpose from the work they do, not just the salary. So I'm hoping that we will have more civil regulation, and in fact we talked today about a civil economy and a civil society, and that is the only thing that's moved into the global governance vacuum at the moment. So I don't look to government.
Don't we have to, you said this is a step-by-step process. Don't they actually have to do what we do for research and development, give an accelerated tax break for spend in this area?
Well, that's what the Europeans have done, and the Dutch government is a very good example. But as I said, the UK government has a minister for corporate social responsibility. Let's agitate for one of those in this country. There's no ownership at the strategic level of this movement.
Environment's a big issue, but let's take simply global warming, which I think is an acute environmental crisis. And one of the things that governments can do is to stop subsidising, for example, road transport, which is vastly subsidised over any other form of transport in Australia, because taxpayers pay for roads and pay for the care of people injured in road deaths and pay for repairs, etc. Whereas if you travel on a train, it's meant to be the passengers who pick up the bill rather than the taxpayers. So, and one of the things that governments have done is and this is an economist's perspective, is distort things so that we actually behave in ways that are environmentally destructive. So one of the things governments could do is pay less heed to vested interests that want to encourage environmentally damaging behaviours. But yes, R&D is an issue, but also encouraging linkages between higher education and industry. One of the things that Australia doesn't do well is invest in education. Sorry, I have to declare a conflict of interest because I'm currently at a higher education institution, but I would have said this anyway. OECD has recently shown that Australia is one of the worst OECD countries in terms of its investment in higher education, and that has a flow-through to what companies can do because they aren't taking advantage of the latest research. So that makes a big difference as well. So there's, I think, an important role for government here, and some of the things that it can do are relatively easy for it to do. Don't take much radical change of direction, and could still have a very big impact.
I have two questions, if I may. Andrew Beattie, thank you very much for your definition of CSR. It was very helpful. Could I ask you a question? Why should we do it? Why should we be engaged in corporate social responsibility? And I don't mean because it improves the bottom line or allows us to attract and retain staff. What's the philosophical reason we should do it? That's the first question. And the second is, how can we as organisations make real change as opposed to perceived process-driven change? I was watching the telly the other night, and I think they had the cock-ups of Hollywood stars on. And it was generally someone who'd been caught in the back of a cab with a prostitute, abused a policeman and so forth. And their PR people said, it's very simple to handle this. You do the following three things. You, first of all, acknowledge your mistake, then you appear contrite, and then you make a commitment to reform, which usually involves going on to an alcohol clinic. Do all that and you'll be fine, and then in a year's time you can go and re-offend. So there was a very strict process put in place by the public relations agency to make it appear as though we were doing something, but there was no change of substance. Are we doing that here, or are we proposing that there will be a change of substance to all these organisations in the world? So two questions there for you.
The first question will be answered by the Professor of Philosophy, I think, rather than a lawyer. Although from a legal point of view, I suppose one could say what was said in Donoghue and Stevenson, which is the birth of the modern law of negligence. The touchstone of that is something which actually comes out of the New Testament, I think, namely, who is my neighbour? What are my duties to my neighbour? Do I have obligations to people whose lives I touch or affect? How do you make real change? Well, I think it's both bottom up and top down. In terms of a corporation leaving aside individuals, you can't really do it with simply, not on a long-term basis, a charismatic individual leader, because CEOs of companies tend only to stay around for 4 or 5 or 6 years. They might leave a mark, but eventually they change and somebody else will come in with a different set of priorities. So it's got to be bottom up and top down, in my view.
I suppose there's 2 possible ways to go, but fortunately they reinforce each other. One is that it's important just because we value it as part of our heritage as people. It's the fact that we're all connected to each other, and we owe moral and ethical duties to each other. That's a sort of a values-based approach. The other approach that's often put in contrast to it is an instrumental approach that says we do it because we benefit from it. And that's also true, that if we act in an ethical or responsible way, this actually has flow-on benefits in terms of the way other people treat us. The way games theorists put this is in terms of something called a prisoner's dilemma, which is, if you're familiar with it, the idea that if you rat on a prisoner in the next cell, you'll be let free quicker. On the other hand, if you don't rat on them, you'll spend just a little bit longer in jail. They're offered the same deal. What's the best strategy? It turns out that the best strategy is to not rat on the other prisoner in the other cell until you discover that they've ratted on you, in which case you really stick the boot in. But we live in a society where, I mean, just empirically, if we do the right thing continually, then in the expectation that others are doing the right thing continually as well, our welfare and our happiness, because there's also a lot of supporting research on happiness, is improved. So, I mean, another way of answering this is the fundamental reason for corporate social responsibility is that all of us are happier as a result, and that's a good thing. I can't actually prove that being happy is better than being sad. You just have to take that as the axiom for this particular ideal.
Could I just add one thing about the prisoner's dilemma, as long as we're on that, which actually is quite appropriate here. The philosophy of the prisoner's dilemma is that you can't get what you know is the best unless somebody will force everybody else to do the same. That is, you can't rely on individuals basically to trust that other people will do what would be individually good if we all did it together. But given that each of us is pretty well one-eyed toward our own benefit, even to get what we want, we can't simply trust that other people will do it as well. The prisoner's dilemma is it's a dilemma. There's somebody right there.
Yes, could I just bring up a few points, please? To shift it on to a really pragmatic level, as you were talking, there were a few points that came to mind. One is that we don't have a federal government that's leading the way. Is there any reason why we can't work with the Victorian state government, who have already started this process, and form some sort of collaborative partnership with them? They hand out a lot of contracts, and not just with the state government, but also with some of their quasi-government organisations. You could certainly persuade them, I would think. There are some departments in particular that could take up this issue of only handing out contracts to organisations that do have a CSR policy. The other thing is on a legal basis, we actually have product recall as a precedence, and that issue could be developed further. There's no need to go through all the arguments about why we can't do it. It's expedient and it's cost effective for companies to have product recall, and we have a history of it in this country. You only have to look at Mars and a couple of the larger organisations. If something's wrong, they'll pull it, and you can certainly use the same arguments. Organisational costs are reasons why businesses don't want to get involved. Certainly they can be linked back with the UN and paperwork that's coming out of there. And lastly, I would suggest that if you're going to have an organisation like MOS and all the work that's been done, hello, where is Anne-Marie? Then you're going to have support from everybody in this room. I mean, Anne-Marie can't carry it on her own. And that's what's happening in this whole area from my experience, is that there's too many people and organisations that are actually working independently of each other. The collaborative framework is not in place. Anne-Marie doesn't have the support that she should have. Organisations need to rally around. Everybody here, whether they're in the non-profit sector or the government or organisations, all pull together and start getting a collective strategy. Just a few comments.
We have time for just one more brief comment. This will be the last one, so whoever's prepared to make it has got to make it a good one.
Hi, I'm Michael Linehan. I'm a partner at Holding Redleaf Lawyers, so Andrew, I understand the sort of reaction you usually get in events like this, but I should say it's been very pleasant down at this table, so maybe you should have come and sat down here. But,
I didn't know you were a lawyer until now.
I spend a lot of my time advising clients on corporate governance, risk management, increasingly CSR issues. One thing that alarms me, surprises me, and sometimes alarms me, I've got some multinational clients that have got operations here in Australia, and they're all in favour of CSR, and that's sort of an easy way to get the job done. I start talking about governance and CSR to some substantial Australian-based clients, and people's eyes still glaze over, and it's really quite surprising, as I said, sometimes alarming. Is legislation the answer? I mean, usually I don't favour further regulation of companies, but is that what we need to actually get it happening here?
Yes and no. The usual argument against legislation is that it produces a ticker-box mentality, lowest common denominator. But on the other hand, the only companies at the moment that are really pushing the sustainability boundaries are the ones with sufficient resources to do it. And there are a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises which probably understand it but don't have the resources to do it. I guess my view is I tend to light-handed regulation. I'd rather see the market take it up. I'd rather see the ASX corporate governance guidelines filter down rather than the government saying to particularly small businesses, here's another form for you to fill in. Let's see what the next few years brings. I tend to think we will see regulation, but it'll probably be light-handed regulation, which I'd be in favour of.
I think the major companies in this country, like Westpac and BHP and all the mining companies who are pushing it down their supply chain, are doing more to introduce it into this country than legislation ever will. In the end, companies aren't going to do this. Even if you do bring in regulation, they'll find a way around it. You have to make it part of the business formula. And so if you're afraid of being locked out of Shell's supply chain or locked out of Westpac's supply chain, you'll get lots of little companies signing up to the agenda much quicker.
I agree entirely. It really has to come from the behaviour of consumers, the behaviour of individuals as voters, the behaviour of shareholders. One of the problems, though, is that in order for people to make well-informed choices, they need an open and independent media. Australia has already the most concentrated media in the Western world, and the government's just introduced changes to legislation that will make it worse, which means that increasingly the main source of information for consumers in Australia will be the opinions of the contestants voted off Australian Idol, which is not your greatest way of developing a good ethical consumer behaviour. We really do have a problem in terms of information, and until we start replacing our current communication mechanisms with something a little more widely distributed, it's going to be really hard for that grassroots pressure to arise, and therefore there may be a need for some legislative or regulatory responses, particularly at state level, as one of the other speakers earlier mentioned, in order to drive this in the interim.
As you would well know, this conversation doesn't have to end at the end of this session, but this session has in fact run out of time. So I'd like you to join with me in thanking Attracta, Andrew, and Stephen.
And Stephen. I'd also like to acknowledge Harry Whelan and Linda Ng, who have been doing microphone help over there. There they are. They're from the Foundation for Young Australians, and it's great to have them with us. Harry is a youth ambassador, and Linda is a volunteer on the Launchpad committee of that organisation. So thank you very much for the work you're doing and for being with us. We've talked a bit about companies misbehaving themselves. I'd just like to read a quote from a statesman, and it goes like this. And this is in the whole ethics area. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption in high places will follow. And the money power of the country will endeavour to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the country is destroyed. Anybody like to guess? Anybody know who said that? And when? It was Abraham Lincoln. And he said it in 1864. You know, we had in 1984. That was 1864, and this is still going on. You know, we've got some work to do here. So that was a great session. Thank you for that. A few announcements. Vanity Fair, your favourite magazine, is available here. It's been Condé Nast UK have very kindly donated 1,500 copies of this magazine, and it's not just a trivial issue. It's the green issue. And has anybody read this? Yeah? I've got it. Oh, there's one hand at the back. I have this next to my bed, as it happens, and I've had it next to my bed for about 2 months, because it goes back a couple of months. But it's all about the green issue. There's articles from activists, as Gore's mentioned. So we have a number of 1,500 copies have been donated to this event. So please help yourself to this magazine. Pass it on to those you want to influence as well as please. The influence people will be the ones who don't agree, and the influence, the please people that do agree with all of this. So that's available at the registration desk. We have a blog, and that blog is available at the Internet Cafe. So Steve, over there, Steve, see Steve at the back over there. Steve will direct you to how to find the blog, which is there, Ian. Yes? Ian's got it on the screen. Yeah, and you can blog yourself to your heart's content. Those of you who haven't blogged before, this is your opportunity. Those of you who love blogging, just don't block everybody else out. That'll be great. So that's happening. There are DVDs and CDs available, books. You have order forms on your tables. Very important, MOS membership. Please, if you are inspired, moved, influenced by anything that's happened over this morning or this afternoon, and you feel you want to join an organisation run by Anne-Marie Huxley that is doing something, this is the thing to do. So that's... Now we have... before I hand you over to Rose. Rose, great. We are going to continue this session in this room at 2 o'clock, stream 1. Will continue in this room, and the CEO Director Forum run by Margot Cairns will take place, I think it's in the Sunset, called the Sunset Room, downstairs. Yes, and in a minute you'll be having lunch, and there are 2 lunch stations. There's one in the corner of this room, and you do your own self-directed table team control. You did it wonderfully well for tea time. I've never seen it happen so well, so good. And there's another station outside. The difference between the two stations is I think that there are orange juice and mineral water available outside, but not in this room. This is tea, coffee and food. So there you are. We have till 2 o'clock. But before we do that, I'm going to invite Rose Reid of AMTA, the Australian Mobile Telecommunications Association, to come and... she's the manager of Australia Mobile Telecommunications Association's mobile phone recycling program. This is a really good thing to be doing. So she's going to introduce us to the Mobile Muster, and we really appreciate their support. Rose.